listening to the Natives Rouseabout podcast. I'm hosting today. My name is Michael, and I have Grant with me.
Hello.
Hello. And today we are going to be talking about Banjo Paterson. You've probably heard the name, but he is definitely one of our most famous national poets and very significant for the Australian nationalist. So we're going to start off with a little bit about the significance of the banjo, and I've got a quote here from P.R. Stevenson, the Foundations of Culture in Australia, Chapter 8, and he says, Banjo Paterson and Henry Lawson may be regarded as typical pioneers of Indigenous culture in Australia. Whatever their faults, their work has an outstanding quality of being drawn direct from Australian life, and not from a bookish or literary idea and imitation of English poets. Lawson and Paterson were both Australian-born and wrote for Australian readers primarily. Their work is crude enough in parts, it is the raw material of an Australian culture, but it is of high national significance as being truly Indigenous.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think that's really like a pretty strong statement of Paterson's importance for the nativist and that establishment of a sort of a native Australian culture set against the Englishman's.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well, like the idea that it is a very raw depiction of Australian attitudes and how an Australian would consider themselves in the world, because it's very it wasn't written like the Bulletin, the newspaper which they were contributors to, was a very kind of well, obviously the editor and publisher J.F. Archibald was French. So he didn't have that kind of English Anglophile level desire to keep everything pommy, I suppose. There's this kind of vein in Australian media, even up to the 50s when Bob Menzies was the Prime Minister, where he assured that all the ABC presenters had thick English accents as opposed to the more vernacular Australian accent. So the Bulletin newspaper, which they were writing in, which Stevenson's talking about as this kind of raw depiction of Australian culture, is kind of unshackled from the more Anglophilic kind of burden on literature, which Stevenson writes a lot about in the Foundation of Culture, where he's kind of discussing this idea that Australian literature had really taken off because they were trying to replicate English forms of writing in the Australian context, but it just didn't gel well. It's probably not the right description, but yeah, it's interesting quote that Stevenson gave us there.
Yeah, 100%. And you sort of covered a few points of context, I suppose, with the Bulletin and all that. But I was thinking it might be worth going through a bit of a timeline or a bio of Paterson before we discuss too many of his poems, just because I think it's a real shame, but we don't always get taught much about the lives of our national heroes these days in school when we go through. And I figured, although such things can tend to be a bit dull, it's probably worth getting a bit of that context. So he was born in 1864 in Narambla, near Orange in New South Wales, and
God's country.
Yeah, he grew up in the bush, and he started his education on his father's station under a governess. So he was part of that sort of, squatter background. But as soon as he was old enough, he would ride a pony to school. So he was already riding from a very young age, and obviously you get that theme of the horse throughout Australian literary culture, but very strong in his poems, like Man from Snowy River and all that. But he was definitely part of the upper classes. He sort of attended Sydney Grammar School in 1874 and eventually became a solicitor in Sydney. I believe he failed his exams for uni or whatever. So these are the days when you could still get into a job basically through an apprenticeship, even if it's law. But he submitted his first verses to J.F. Archibald's journal, the Bulletin, which was nationalist and Republican, so sometimes called radical nationalist. And interestingly, among these was an anti-imperialist poem, which was one of his early ones, El Mahdi to the Australian troops. And that one was against Australian participation in the war in Sudan. So I guess drawing a bit more on the Republican side of things. And especially he sort of appealed to ideals of freedom and self-determination there. So I guess you could call it nationalist as well, but it was definitely more against empire.
Yeah, I mean, the war just a little sidetrack to those who don't know the story of the war in the Sudan. This is obviously this is in the 1890s when the empire, the British Empire, was kind of at its zenith, and they made Egypt a protectorate, and there was a lot of Egyptian settlers that were in the Sudan for economic reasons, and the local Sudanese, the kind of sub-Saharan black Africans who had taken up Islam. I mean, Islam was already through Egypt as well. They thought that the Mahdi, which is the promised one, had come up as this guy who's going to conquer Constantinople and create this caliphate all the way through the Middle East. The British tried to protect the Egyptians in the Sudan and ended up getting through a whole bunch of scheming, using mostly Australian troops to do the fighting. And there was an incredible battle towards the end of that war where there was tens of thousands of the Sudanese Mahdist forces were killed in battle, but there wasn't a single death on the Australian force. But anyway, interesting times. There's a crossover there where Paterson is writing commentary on that war, and it was also the first combat that Winston Churchill ever saw.
Interesting.
On foot.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
But anyway, go on. Sorry, bit of a side step, but yeah.
Yeah, no, well, it's worth discussing because a lot of these earlier wars are not so well known as the world wars like Sudan and the Boer Wars, and despite them, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think
earlier times
that's right.
Went into combat.
The Sudan War was the first time that Australian soldiers were posted kind of in an overseas conflict, which before the Boer War. I mean, often people think the Boer War was the first one. I mean, that was truly the case after Federation, but long before Federation, like a good decade before, there was the contingent of Australian imperial troops that were sent to the Sudan. But anyway, on we go.
Yeah. So that was in the 1880s, I believe. Then his political pamphlet, again, something that's not very well known about him, but before his real famous poems had come out, he already had published under his real name this pamphlet, Australia for the Australians, showing the necessity for land reform combined with protection. I think the title might be a bit telling as well, perhaps on that bulletin influence, since that was on the sort of the title head before it changed in the 90s to Australia for the White Man. But yeah, so just off the title obviously tells you what it is, like all good 19th century titles, but he's advocating land reform and protection. And that was published under his real name, Andrew Barton Paterson. And he was using a pen name at the time, the Banjo, which is obviously where we get famous and very recognizable name from. Going on a bit further, 1892, we got the Bush versus City controversy, also called the Bulletin Debate, which was really just contrived by Banjo and Henry Lawson, but it was this sort of, which one is greater? Is it the cities or is it the bush? And Lawson is sort of really known for his more pessimistic view of the countryside and his sort of more pessimistic outlook on life in general. Whereas Banjo, I think, is probably a bit more popular because, to the extent that he's still popular today, unfortunately, perhaps it's not as much as it used to be. But I think the reason he is more popular in some of his works, like obviously Waltzing Matilda, have become so great, is that he did have a bit more of an optimistic outlook on life. Yeah, maybe not in Waltzing Matilda, but generally.
yeah, he sure did. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, we've already brought up the fact he was raised in a kind of maybe middle to upper class kind of background. So when he travelled the countryside on horseback, where Henry Lawson, his competitor in the Bulletin debate, grew up poor on real rough country, which his family struggled over for years and couldn't grow any productive crops and make much money. And, Henry Lawson, kind of travelled the bush on foot, doing a bit of shearing here and there and never really had much money. And so, like, the different background and the success of both people kind of filters through to their literature. So, as you said, Banjo was far more optimistic, more white-pilled about life in the bush, where Lawson was very black-pilled and was very kind of also came through with a far more kind of socialist, radical socialist point of view. Obviously, growing up in a poor context, he wanted to try to rescue the impoverished, where Banjo was kind of more of the vein of this kind of more broadly Australian sentiment, which was definitely socialistic, but it was far less radical than I think what Lawson had, by virtue of his hard upbringing and his life as a young man, walking the bush on foot. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably also why Lawson has a much stronger thread of this theme of like mateship through his poems than Banjo, because I haven't noticed it as much in the Banjo poems that I have read. But just to not get off track on a Lawson,
yeah.
1898, still going through the timeline, with the outbreak of the Boer War. This is where Banjo gets to be a war correspondent. So it marks I have actually skipped that The Man from Snowy River and Other Verses, his first book and great success, was published in 1895. Probably worth mentioning that because that is what made him famous in Australia and across the entire empire, where he was favourably compared with Rudyard Kipling. He was sort of considered to be basically Australia's Kipling, which I guess is also, with the becoming a war correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald in the Boer War, that's sort of both those things are marking a shift to sort of a more pro-imperial outlook in Banjo and perhaps across Australian nationalism more generally. Sort of as you head towards federation, I guess you still would have more Republican sentiment perhaps among the working class movement, but I think
no, you're right. It's interesting actually what happened in the tail end of the century there. It happened in the ANA as well. In the earliest era of the ANA, in probably the 1880s, 1870s, there was far more of a Republican sentiment. And then when we started walking towards the turn of the century, there was a far more imperial outlook on things. And I think what kind of drove that was the view of the rise of Asia, where this kind of reliance upon the British to defend, this white Australian continent, where before, when there was no real concern about any kind of Asian competitor in terms of actually industrial military force, I think people were far more easily to consider a more staunchly independent Australia. And I think probably Banjo went through a similar progression as well with the rest of the country. There was a more Republican fervour earlier in the century than to when it shifted.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So just finishing up on his life for the last couple of points that I wanted to make, but obviously once he returned from the Boer War, and he did meet Kipling there as well, he tried out life managing a station in New South Wales, but that didn't really work out so well. I think he ended up back in the city. And then with the outbreak of the First World War, he went over to Europe and served first as an ambulance driver in France, but then he heard that the Australians were raising a light horse brigade, so I think he went back and he enlisted to join that, and so ended up joining the Australian Light Horse in 1915, and through his service he attained the rank of major. So he did have that sort of military Anzac experience as well. So sort of covering all these points that are so important to Australian nationalism in his life, and to the sort of the symbolism that we draw upon to look at Australian identity. And speaking of Australian identity, he also joined the Sportsman as an editor in 1919, stayed with it until 1930. He was, avidly into sports throughout his entire life. And, sporting culture is something in Australia that really goes all the way back to the early colony.
Ancient Athens.
Yeah, the Olympics. We're going to do the Putin interview thing where we, back, in the 5th century BC.
After the outgoings of the Australian race from Troy, we've carried with us the sporting influence ever since.
Yep. So, but I was going to say it was sort of a thing with the currency culture and the sterling, as you've mentioned in past things. But it was something where the native-born Australians could show that they were on the same level as the British-born, and even superior. Banjo joined Sportsman as editor in 1919, stayed with it until 1930, and then died eventually on February 5th, 1941, after a brief period of illness. So he did see quite a bit of the 20th century as well. Usually we're thinking back to the bush and the disappearance of the sort of bush culture, and it's in the 19th, late 19th century, but sort of this is going all the way through early 20th. Yeah. Speaking of the Sportsman, poem from it, I believe, published in 1923, a job for McGuinness. I figured we'd read this one because it sort of illustrates some of these points that we've discussed, like the threat from Asia, shifting to this more pro-imperial thing. But here's a reading from, a job for McGuinness. Oh, it's dreadful to think, in a country like this, with its chances for work and enjoyment, that a man like McGuinness was certain to miss whenever he tried for employment. He wrote to employers from Bondi to Burke, from Woolloomooloo to Glen Innes, but he found, though his wife could get plenty of work, there was never a job for McGuinness. But perhaps later on, when the Chow and the Jap begin to drift down from the tropics, when a big yellow stain spreading over the map provides some disquieting topics, it's then when they're wanting a man that will stand in the trench where his own kith and kin is, with a frown on his face and a gun in his hand, then there might be a job for McGuinness.
Yep, it's that's a pretty staunch nationalist sentiment there, I think.
Yeah, he's definitely not pulling any punches.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting, Banjo. People often think of Henry Lawson as the staunch nationalist in terms of the more, kind of ethno-racial concepts of nationalism. But Banjo had plenty on the shelf to say about this kind of threat of, the expansion of Asia into Australia. I mean, obviously he'd lived through it. If he was born in 1860s, New South Wales, by the time he would have been a young to middle-aged adult in Sydney, there was a significant contingent of Asians and also Afghans in the city that had been brought in for various reasons. I mean, obviously, we don't have to go over all the history. There's plenty of podcast material that we've gone over in past time, but he does reflect the general sentiment of Australians that that it would be an undesirable thing to be displaced from the country by Asia.
I think another theme there, perhaps less immediately pulling the attention, but he points out that this country, Australia, has like immense potential, right? It is meant to be this working man's paradise. So it's meant to have these chances for work and enjoyment, right? And that really has always been a part, I think, of the Banjo's politics from very early on, as I mentioned, with that little political pamphlet of his, the Australia for the Australians. I mean, it is in there in a couple of points, but in chapter 1, he says that the only way to improve the welfare and prosperity of the country at large is to improve the individual welfare and prosperity of the inhabitants. So, to advance Australia, we must advance the Australians, and the question of individual advancement is really the question of the greatest national importance. And he goes on to discuss things like the 8 hours that was achieved and the importance of keeping high wages. So,
yeah, I mean, on that subject as well, I couldn't remember what the name of it was until now, but he had another poem that he wrote called A Bushman's Song. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it basically recounts the story of a shearer who goes to a shearing shed, which is shorn by Chinamen. I'll quote from it. I asked a cove for shearing once along the Martha Guy. We shear non-union here, says he. I call it scab, says I. I looked along the shearing floor before I turned to go, and there were 8 or 10 dashed Chinamen shearing in a row. It was shift, boys, shift, for there wasn't the slightest doubt. It was time to make a shift with all the leprosy about. So I saddled up my horses and whistled to my dog, and I left his scabby station at the old jig jog. So there's another depiction there of, this was written around 1892, I believe, right. Which is right about the time the Great Shearers' Strike was kicking off, which we've mentioned in other podcasts. Was William Spence, the founder of the Labor Party and the Australian Workers' Union, identified that the main cause of the strike was basically to prevent the introduction of Chinese scabs to the shearing sheds, because around that time the price of wool had fallen and the squatters were trying to keep their profit margins by taking a gouge out of the workers' wages, which were set by the union. So, yeah, I think, Banjo was definitely sympathetic to the plight of the working man. And in the time of the Great Shearers' Strike, which is when he wrote this Bushman's Song, there was a very real risk for a large portion of the country to lose their conditions and their welfare and their standard of living due to the desperation of Chinese scab labor.
Yeah, absolutely. So he did obviously live through those key events of the maritime strike and the shearers' strike, and he was definitely like Spence, I guess, more part of that producerist kind of Australian socialist bent. Spence, I believe, was actually a Georgite, or he held to the philosophy of Henry George on, and I think Banjo, while not, he explicitly says he doesn't agree with the Georgite remedy. He does believe that the basic problem is that essentially there's all the good land is being hoarded by these, I guess, land barons and so on. Obviously, that's only gotten worse today, as we see with the the rental crises and massive foreign ownership and all these problems.
That's right. I mean, you can look at the history of it as well, and like we recount that it's really bad today, but it was also tremendously bad towards the 1890s as well. If you look into the history books in the New South Wales and Victorian land booms of the period, basically there was a speculative property bubble akin to today, which had basically caused a huge overcrowding of the towns and the cities, that most of the productive agricultural land was wound up by these barons. And the bigger problem, I think, which we will get into in a minute when we talk about Australia for the Australians, all this productive land was kind of sitting half vacant and wasn't being productively used, which means there was no need for labor and providing wages, and they were able to basically just hoard this land. So among the Labor Party's first platforms towards federation was a land tax, and that was a pretty staunch thing they were arguing for. Like, if you weren't using land productively, it needs to be carved up so settler farmers can take it on and use it so to get the most optimization out of the land and provide an increase in everyone's standard of living.
Yeah, and that is, I believe, directly out of Henry George, the single tax. The only thing you're taxing is land, but not much of that, unfortunately, I guess, remains in the Australian political consciousness. I believe the only sort of vestigial element of it is that local councils will basically tax you on the value of your unimproved land when you get a land tax from the local council. But it's a bit of trivia, really.
Yeah, that's right. And look, I think the way the economy has shifted as well, like even though there probably still is merit in land tax, it's definitely the highest yielding forms of production are kind of far less associated with land now, especially in more of a service economy. But yeah, it's an interesting concept, and there's definitely still enormous land holdings in this country which are not being productively used, and they're just sitting idle because it doesn't cost the landholder much to hold on to it. You know, he would rather park himself to speculate on the value of the land on unimproved land. But yeah, it's a perennial issue is what I'm kind of getting back to. The whole housing shortage and land price is very similar now as it was at the tail end of the 19th century.
Yeah, definitely the case. So perhaps we should talk a little bit more about what is in Australia for the Australians. Yeah, I mean, it really is about, I guess, primarily producing. So chapter 2 is on the system of production, and he basically makes the point that all the living that we get does sort of eventually derive out of the earth of its products, and that, you know, we're all engaged more or less directly in obtaining and improving those products for our use. He basically, what he's saying is that if there's too many people, or that there are too many people basically crowded into the cities and the suburbs, he says 1/3 of the population at the time, crowding into the townships, cutting one another's throats to get employment, most of their time half idle, when the towns really are living on the produce of the country. And I mean, that's always been the case for Australia. We've never really managed to break out of this sort of, I guess, colonial economy where we're heavily dependent on primary industry. And that is why I think Banjo directly says it. We need protection rather than free trade, because, as he says, you know, the question is whether it's better for a community such as ours to exchange its raw materials for the manufacturers of other countries, or to tax its own people and create manufacturers, right? And he says, you know, we might command the markets for raw material, which, you know, to some extent we do. But directly he says, is it a fitting destiny for such a nation as ours that we should have no higher objects than to grow wool and reap corn? Are we to have no arts nor manufacturers? These things will only grow by protection. And I mean, has it really changed, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, nothing's changed. Yeah, and that's the thing as well. It's an age-old debate. Before the Liberal and the Labor Party, it was the free traders and the protectionists, and Labor. And Labor definitely were more inclined to the protectionist view. And you know that free trading is just such a boomer mindset from my point of view. It's just like we require the cheapest possible consumer goods. Having more expensive consumption expenses is unacceptable. Like, despite the fact, like, you know, if you think about what we import versus what we export, like, we produce plenty of food, we produce plenty of wool. There's no reason why we couldn't have affordable food, clothing, housing, like all the essentials. I mean, we produce iron, steel. The thing that the free traders clang for is this, you know, all the stuff that you don't really need. This kind of all this, electronics and like the plastic toys and just junk. A lot of foreign junk is what we import. We export just premium quality products of various kinds, and then we're, suffocating infant industries. I mean, we had a really good crack at production for a long time, and I think on the balance of everything, it was very, very good. I mean, the cost of living on average was probably higher. Like you'd grant that, but it also meant that there was, meaningful employment just about everywhere, and that we had national self-sufficiency. Our supply chains were very much secure and internal. We're reliant on foreign production, and it's kind of the whole. We bait them in on low prices to flatten their industries, and then when they're completely reliant on us, we jack up the prices. And I think we've probably seen that happen in the last 10 years or 15 years with China. So many consumer goods that used to be dirt cheap are now actually, fair income bloody prices that you'd almost get made in Australia for.
Yeah. I mean, the economy is certainly getting worse, but maybe we could go into a whole tangent here on I guess the geopolitical effects of losing our own independent manufacturing as well, and obviously that's hit the US very hard. They hadn't really woken up to that necessarily until I guess Trump almost sort of brought this idea of protection back into fashion a little bit, but we haven't really seen a lot of concrete stuff out of that, or concrete policies, I suppose. I think there's just there's so much momentum behind neoliberalism and the sort of economic rationalism that came in the late 70s, early 80s, in Australia at least, that I don't really necessarily see us getting back to that without some sort of, I guess, radical movement, or perhaps nationalists really need to hit on these points a bit more, and not just stick to the racial question, but anyway, go on.
I was just going to say, like, the direction that this policy takes seems to be less so tied to like political hot takes, but more down to like the actual what motivates people, like the average person, because the decision ultimately is to the average person, is it worth having more expensive consumer goods in exchange for having more employment or secure employment, and also the guarantee of supply chains, secure supply chains, or would they just rather have cheaper consumer goods and rely on foreign supply chains and try to cash in on foreign supply chains in this whole kind of service economy, which is, universities, international finance. Like, yeah, we own shares in these foreign companies. It really comes down to the fact that most people aren't willing to make a sacrifice in terms of losing their cheap Chinese consumer goods, so they will remain reliant upon it.
Yeah, it is unfortunate, and it is
it's materialism, It is a cultural issue. Yeah.
I think I did have a few poems picked out that we would have a look at. So it's been a while. I think the only one we've covered has been A Job for McGuinness. So I better. And you brought up that other one off the cuff as well. But I think I might take us to Clancy of the Overflow, because for me this is one of his greatest poems, and I believe that this whole concept of this key line of Clancy's gone to Queensland droving and we don't know where he are. I believe that's a real message he got when he was riding out into the bush to chase up a dead or something. But I'll read the poem because it will give us a bit of context for that line. But I had written him a letter, which I had, for want of better knowledge, sent to where I met him down the Lachlan years ago. He was shearing when I knew him, so I sent the letter to him, just on spec, addressed as follows: Clancy of the Overflow. and an answer came directed in a writing unexpected, and I think the same was written with a thumbnail dipped in tar. 'Twas his shearing mate who wrote it, and verbatim I will quote it. Clancy's gone to Queensland droving, and we don't know where he are. In my wild erratic fancy, visions came to me of Clancy, gone a droving down the Cooper where the western drovers go. As the stock are slowly stringing, Clancy rides behind them singing, for the drover's life has pleasures that the townsfolk never know. And the bush hath friends to meet him, and their kindly voices greet him in the murmur of the breezes and the river on its bars. And he sees the vision splendid of the sunlit plains extended, and at night the wondrous glory of the everlasting stars. I am sitting in my dingy little office where a stingy ray of sunlight struggles feebly down between the houses tall, and the fetid air and gritty of the dusty, dirty city through the open window floating spreads its foulness over all. And in place of lowing cattle, I can hear the fiendish rattle of the tramways and the buses making hurry down the street, and the language uninviting of the gutter children fighting comes fitfully and faintly through the ceaseless tramp of feet. And the hurrying people daunt me, and their pallid faces haunt me as they shoulder one another in their rush and nervous haste, with their eager eyes and greedy and their stunted forms and weedy, for townsfolk have no time to grow, they have no time to waste. And I somehow rather fancy that I'd like to change with Clancy, like to take a turn at droving where the seasons come and go, while he faced the round eternal of the cash book and the journal, but I doubt he'd suit the office, Clancy of the overflow.
Yeah, powerful.
Powerful stuff. And you do get some of those themes we've discussed of the bush versus the city there. And I think it is sort of this pastoral nationalism, I guess, that you do get in most countries, I suppose, because there is that connection between race and place, as Stephenson would have it, or, that connection to the soil.
Mm.
And that whole idea of the bush having friends to meet him, and so the native animals and their sounds, the kookaburra, I guess, and all that, and the beautiful wattle. So yeah, I mean, we sort of had to overcome this biological cringe, I guess, as well as a cultural cringe, because in our poetry there was a lot of, I guess, very strong English references to nightingales and sort of British style green landscapes as opposed to the drier bush. So it was really, I think, Banjo and Lawson that did help us to overcome that in our national literature.
Yeah. I mean, they were definitely, they were children of the bush, both of them, and you really have to be a child of the bush to have a true and full appreciation of the things that they wrote about. We take for granted the song of the magpie in the morning, and we take for granted the long dry afternoon sun and the sleeping out on the porch, protected from the because it's too hot inside the house, like all the kind of childhood experiences that come from being on the land versus the kind of the city. The city always has been this kind of globalist, kind of delocalized kind of stain. I love the description of the gutter children fighting. It's like you imagine the young kids with Adidas bum bags punching on in the street. Like, accurate depiction of, like, the cities never change. I find no honor in them. There was a fellow I knew once upon a time who thought we should make it illegal to have buildings taller than 2 stories, but I won't go into that that rabbit hole. But Clancy, I love this poem. It's cracker.
It is great. And I just love the bush as well. And I grew up in the suburbs, but there's nothing greater than just going out there in the landscape and walking through and walking across fields and stuff. And I've got a few mates in the bush, so it's always lovely to go out there and have a look at it. Hopefully one day I'll be heading out that way myself. But powerful.
Yeah. Take the bush pill. It's good. I mean, to know the silence, the stillness in the bush, and the clear air and the sense of freedom. If you take a couple of nights camping trip out on the Murrumbidgee River or something like that, you suddenly realize just how large this country is and how it's kind of ungovernable in a way. It's just such an enormous, sprawling kind of landscape. There's just this supreme sense of freedom once you've kind of shaken out of the street plans of the city and the highway.
Yeah, I mean, and it's still the case where you have these hurrying people with their pallid faces and their greed, or their stunted forms and weedy, as he puts it, right? Yeah, you head into Melbourne or Sydney or any of these major cities, and you'll definitely see these people.
They won't look you in the eye. If you try to say hello, they'll quickly look at the ground and scurry off awkwardly.
Yeah, they've got no time to waste.
Yeah, that's right. Urbanites. Meanwhile, out here in the bush paradise, if you go for a walk down the street, say hello to someone, they'll look you in the eye and say hello back. People will anticipate that you wanted to cross the road and they'll come to a screeching halt in the middle of the street. You know, things like that. You just don't get it in the city experience. So, yeah, there's so much merit to this kind of romance for the bush and the romance for the people of the bush as well, and the life that comes out of this kind of gritty, materialist, kind of rushed, vain city living. But yeah, anyway, we could lament upon this for about an hour. I think we got that covered.
Yeah, for sure. I think we're coming pretty close to the end. I anticipated we'd go for about an hour, but I think it might be perhaps we'll discuss one more poem or something, and then call it a day. So
Old Australian Ways gets my vote.
You reckon Old Australian? I was thinking Song of the Federation, but we could skip over reading it. That one is interesting because it does bring in that sort of military legend a bit more. I guess it's more of a prefiguration of Anzac. But
yeah, true.
Which we haven't really discussed as much. But we could go on Old Australian Ways because it does bag the poem a bit, and that's always a bit of fun.
Yeah.
Do you want to give this one a read, or?
Yeah, I can read this one.
Yeah.
I'll save your lungs. Okay. The Old Australian Ways. The London lights are far abeam, behind a bank of cloud. Along the shore the gas lights gleam, and the gale is piping loud. And down the channel, groping blind, we drive her through the haze, towards the land we've left behind, the good old land of Nevermind and Old Australian Ways. The narrow ways of English folk are not for such as we. They bear the long accustomed yoke of staid conservancy. But all our roads are new and strange, and through our blood there runs the vagabonding love of change that drove us westward of the range and westward of the suns. The city folk go to and fro behind a prison's bars. They never feel the breezes blow and never see the stars. They never hear the blossom trees, the music low and sweet of wild birds making melodies, nor catching the little laughing breeze that whispers in the wheat. Our fathers came of roving stock that could not fix abide, and we have followed field and flock since ere we learnt to ride. By miners' camp and shearing shed, in land of heat and drought, we followed where our fortunes led, with fortune always on ahead and always further out. The wind is in the barley grass, the wattles are in bloom, the breezes greet us as they pass with honey sweet perfume. The parakeets go screaming by with flash of golden wing, and from the swamp the wild ducks cry, their long-drawn note of revelry, rejoicing at the spring. So throw the weary pen aside, and let the papers rest, for we must saddle up and ride toward the blue hill's breast, and we must travel far and fast across their rugged maze, to find the spring of youth at last, and call back from the buried past the old Australian ways. When Clancy took the drover's track in years of long ago, he drifted to the outer back beyond the overflow. By rolling plain and rocky shelf, with stock whip in his hand, he reached at last, oh lucky elf, the town of come and help yourself in rough and ready land. And if it should be that you would know the tracks he used to ride, then you must saddle up and go beyond the Queensland side, beyond the reach of rule or law, to ride the long day through in nature's homestead, filled with awe. Then you might see what Clancy saw and know what Clancy knew.
Great stuff. Great stuff.
Mm.
I think that those two lines, and call back from the buried past, the old Australian ways, and that really kind of sums up what the ANA is about for us, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
I mean, so many of us have grown up in these deracinated sort of suburbs where it's just completely cosmopolitan, it's completely Americanized. Yeah, you know, you turn on the TV and it's all Yanks all over it.
Mm.
And we really do need to call back from that past old Australian ways so that we can, you know, basically consolidate our people around this idea. And, you know, maybe it's not going to be all of us, but there needs to be a core group of men who do know what Clancy knew, right, about this country.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, to us, I mean, to all nations, there has to be a national mythology. And, you know, the leftist will, you know, the cosmopolitan leftist, let me rephrase that. The cosmopolitan cuckold would love to tell you that all of this mythology that Banjo and Lawson wrote is pure myth, and therefore it's invalid, it has no value, has no weight, that we should integrate ourselves with a global deracinated, Hollywood-driven culture, and have no connection to this great kind of creation mythology of this country and of our national identity and our heritage. You know, that is it's death. Every nation needs to have a cultural mythology which they value, and it doesn't matter, you know, how much of it is, you know, factually completely on the level. Like every nation has its own kind of mythology about its creation and about what values kind of generated by their history. And so those things are valuable to us. We need to generate amongst ourselves a common sense of identity and belonging and purpose. And to have those things, it has to be rooted in our national heritage. And it goes to all these other, you know, radicals in these days, picking up the mantle of foreign causes, you know, people role-playing as Trotskyite, you know, wobblies, or people role-playing as brown shirts in the Third Reich. You know, you need to be associated and deeply rooted and derivative from your nationality to have any kind of, to do any honor to your ancestors anyway. If you have any interest in doing that, which I think any sane person would, you have to look at the merits of, you know, the ways the people of old, the generations of old, you know. What does Moses say to the Israelites? Remember the days of old and the years of the many generations. You know, you should be doing justice to your heritage. And that's what we're about. We're about doing that. We're about trying to see the protection and preservation of this culture, which we think is noble and worthy of preservation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, not falling for those narrow ways of the English folk and all that. Indeed. Because there are a lot of very interesting themes in all these poems that you can discuss. But I mean, even here, that breaking away of Australian culture from the British. And I think the best way I've read it or seen it put is that Britishness became essentially a part of Australian culture rather than the other way around. And we really need to get our priorities straight on that one and make sure that we're doing Australian culture justice and not obviously abandoning those British elements that did help shape the country, but recognizing that we have gone, you know, above and beyond that, and that we are rooted in this soil, we are rooted in this land, and that you know, as Banjo puts it, you know, we come from a certain stock. Our fathers came of roving stock that could not fixed abide, right? And all these sort of people who had, I guess, the tenacity, the courage to head out to a land, whether, obviously for the convicts, that was not their choice, but there were a lot of free settlers that came with them as well, people who wanted to make their way and to basically take on these opportunities of a great new country. And especially when you hit the sort of the gold rush era, those people obviously decided to come here and pursue that fortune, as as Banjo has it as well. We followed where our fortunes led, with fortune always on ahead. And so, yeah, I mean, we sort of need to channel a bit of that spirit and have a bit of agency, I think, in the nationalist movement. And people need to sort of to step up and see what they can do and really pursue the vision, pursue the dream, follow that fortune. Because if we don't do anything, we are going to just default to this cosmopolitan vision, and we need to have that constructive view of nationalism where it's, you do have to, like, I don't want to sound like a modernist and say it's all like a social construct and it's, it's completely contrived. It obviously is rooted in something real. Like, we did not create the bush. The bush created it, the bush shaped Australia rather than the other way around, I guess. But we still need to consciously take hold of our heritage and claim it for our own, and realize the potential that we have in this country. As going back to his political work, he says, what is our destiny? Is our destiny always to be this basically mining agricultural colony of foreign powers? Are we always going to be under the Brits or the Yanks, or is it going to be, is it going to be the Chinese or the Indians in the future? Like, there just doesn't seem to be the will among our people to really take hold of our destiny, take hold of our own interests, and push forward to something greater.
That's right. I think a part of that as well, kind of trying to channel some of this energy from the old Australian ways. That expression, to follow where our fortunes led, with fortune always on ahead and always further out. Last line there is a bit of a wink and a nod to escaping places where a house is going to cost you $1.5 to $2 million. I think part of the the vision for the ANA and what the vision should be for nationalists, beyond just the advancement of the cause. Well, let's rephrase that. The advancement of the cause is going to be built on the back of men who have built their own capabilities, that have built their own property, built their own careers, built their own capability in the community. And for a lot of people that are in the cities, they're going to have to pull the trigger and go further out where fortune lays for them. There's no fortune to be found at the in this kind of rental housing and house price crisis. We should encourage people to go out into the frontiers, like George Reid said, the former free trade prime minister, to leave the luxury and comfort of the city, to go further out like your forefathers did, and in hard work and labor, build a new paradise. We should look up at that mantle, obviously geographically, like moving out of the cities. That's my opinion anyway. But we should also look at it from like a metaphysical point of view, to go out and build the association up and build up our infrastructure, build something that's going to be permanent and lasting and for the benefit of others and for the good of the next generation. We are the inheritors of this vision of Australia, and some of the last people that are willing to stand up and struggle for this cause of what our forebears, desired for this country and desired for their descendants to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, I believe we have pretty much hit the hour there. So I think we will be drawing this Natives Roundabout episode to a close. We will be looking at putting out the podcast probably about monthly on significant Australian themes. That's our thing. So if you are interested, keep an eye out monthly for the podcast. Will be going up, I believe, on the YouTube channel as well as the website. And make sure you spread our content, spread it over on Twitter, wherever it might be. But have some of that agency and contribute to the cause.
That's it. All right. Thanks for listening.
The London lights are far abeam behind a bank of cloud. Along the shore the gas lights gleam, the gale is piping loud. And down the channel, groping blind, we drive her through the haze, towards the land we left behind, the good old land of never mind, and old Australian ways. The narrow ways of English folk are not for such as we. They bear the long accustomed yoke of state conservancy. But all our roads are new and strange, and through our blood there runs the vagabonding love of change that drove us westward of the rain and westward of the sun. The city folk go to and fro behind a prison's bars. They never feel the breezes blow and never see the stars. They never hear in blossom trees the music low and sweet of wild birds making melodies, nor catch the little laughing breeze that whispers in the weed. Our fathers came of roving stock that could not fix to buy, and we have followed field and flock since ere we learnt to ride. By miners' camp and shearing shed, in land of heat and drought, we followed where our fortunes led, with fortune always on ahead and always further out. The wind is in the barley grass, the wattles are in bloom. The breezes greet us as they pass with honey sweet perfume. The parakeets go screaming by with flash of golden wing. And from the swamp the wild ducks cry their long-drawn note of revelry, rejoicing at the spring. So throw the weary pen aside and let the papers rest, for we must saddle up and ride toward the blue hill's breast, and we must travel far and fast across their rugged maze, to find the spring of youth at last, and call back from the buried past the old Australian ways. When Clancy took the drover's track in years of long ago, he drifted to the outer back beyond the overflow. By rolling plain and rocky shelf, the stock whip in his hand, he reached at last, oh lucky elf, the town of Come and Help Yourself in rough and ready land. it be that you would know the tracks he used to ride, then you must saddle up and go beyond the Queensland side, beyond the reach of rule or law, to ride the long day through. In nature's homestead filled with awe, you then might see what Clancy saw, and know what Clancy